Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're watching this, as always. And so, what we're going to continue talking about today is slavery and Western expansion, which has certainly been a huge topic when it comes to all these Western expansion of all these states. California, Texas, New Mexico, all these kind of territories and states were in the process of adding kind of in the 1840s in the aftermath of the Mexican American War. Now that once we've captured those or taken control of those, now the situation is okay, what role is slavery going to play in those territories, and what does that mean for all those states back east? Okay, because the ones back east realize that if there is going to be some sort of a conflict or animosity, that's where it's going to occur. Is really, whatever happens west is going to have consequences from the east. So the Mexican American War only severely increased all those sectional tensions that I've been talking about. We've been dealing with for some time now between North and South, that industrial North and the kind of cotton based slavery South. And now that we're taking in all these new tracts of land, again, what role is slavery going to play in these territories? There is going to be a provision added to a war appropriations bill known as the Wilmot Proviso that is just kind of has nothing to do really with anything regarding slavery. It's just this kind of random war appropriations bill as far as the Department of War, how they're spending their money. This just kind of gets thrown in there, snuck in there, that says, you know what, slavery should be banned from any newly acquired territories. And so this is going to be seen by the slave states naturally as a sort of attack and a provocation, and they're going to take it as such. So the Southerners are outraged by this, that this, relatively straightforward war appropriations bill that has really nothing to do functionally with slavery, that these northern states are trying to add, oh, by the way, somewhere down further down, that, you know what, slavery should be outright banned in these newly acquired territories. That's going to naturally outrage Southerners who want slavery expanded to all the new territories. So that Wilmot Proviso is going to pass the House because the northern states had kind of, larger share of the House, but it's going to fail in the Senate. And Calhoun himself, John C. Calhoun, a staunch opponent of this, again, a proud Southerner from South Carolina. And so he really takes the charge in opposing the Wilmot Proviso from being passed. Moderates on, kind of both sides are trying to come up with a solution, and they kind of arrive at an idea that they think is the best one, but it's going to turn out to only complicate things even further, is called the popular sovereignty, where the actual citizens of that territory themselves decide the policy, right? So Kansas is going to be one of those big territories where, okay, we're going to add the state of Kansas. Instead of the Northerners or Southerners decide, why don't we let the people of Kansas decide? Okay, so moderates see this as kind of a middle ground where, hey, let's not put it in our hands, let's put it in the hands of the people out west. And so it's seen as a good idea at the time, but actually letting some of these territories decide for themselves is going to lead to some more important, larger problems, really, more than anything. So, hey, let's maybe just let these states themselves decide instead of Washington, D.C. deciding. And so, again, that's going to be a big talking point. Abolitionists are naturally also on the other side outraged by this because they're saying, hey, this is denying African Americans their right to freedom, quite naturally. And abolitionism is still a minority opinion, but is getting a little louder and a little louder during this time of the late 1840s. So they're saying, no, absolutely not. This is, we think Washington, D.C. actually has a better chance to decide this than the people themselves. And so abolitionists, they're disappointed by this idea of popular sovereignty. Meanwhile, you have the other side, slave owners and Southerners are opposed to this Wilmot Proviso because that's trying to ban slavery in all these newly acquired territories. So there's trying to be compromises on both sides. Popular sovereignty is going to be seen as a little bit of a compromise where it's like, all right, again, let the territories themselves decide, leave Washington, D.C. out of it. And all these tensions are going to lead kind of to the very interesting election of 1848. And here the Whigs are going to nominate Zachary Taylor, who was a general during the Mexican-American War. And again, by this point, we've had several presidents who had, leadership positions in wars and generals. And so that's kind of a natural step to the presidency. So Zachary Taylor is going to follow on that. And it was complicated because he himself was a Whig who generally opposed slavery, but at the same time, he was a large-scale slave owner. So a lot of people, his current Whig friends thought, oh, he's going to want to expand all that westward. Okay, so then within the Whig Party, there's going to start to be a split The pro-slavery Whigs are going to be more for Tyler, are going to be known as the Cotton Whigs. Meanwhile, the anti-slavery Whigs who leave the party in protest are going to be known as the Conscience Whigs. So that Whig party that was seen as maybe the only real viable party to oppose slavery is now at self-splitting, which, as you can imagine, is going to lead to disastrous results for them. At the same time, there's yet another party that's kind of emerging, known as the Free Soil Party. And this is going to actually be important later on. And it's kind of a combination of some of these conscience Whigs who are against slavery, as well as some anti-slavery Democrats. So the Democratic Party at this time is mostly in favor of slavery, pretty overwhelmingly. But there are going to be some who aren't comfortable with it and want to break away, especially some in New York, which makes sense. They're a more northern state. And so the Free Soil Party, this is very important to remember, they do not believe in slavery in any newly acquired territories. They think every territory that's going to be acquired should have no slavery in it. Okay, so every new territory will have slavery. All the old ones, we're not saying we necessarily need to get rid of them in the old ones, but when it comes to new territories, we don't want slavery there. Okay, and most just want to preserve employment prospects for whites. And these kind of free soil parties are actually going to nominate former President Martin Van Buren, who, again, only served one term. He was elected in 1836, served to 1840 before he was defeated by William Henry Harrison. So he's back in the spotlight now. Then Free Soil Party tries to get behind him. But again, this split between the Free Soilers and the Democrats are going to actually give Zachary Taylor, the win. Okay, so the Whig Party officially wins, but those Whigs who broke away didn't want to join the party because of slavery and these Free Soilers, they're going to split the vote, okay, between Van Buren and the Conscience Whigs Democrats who nominated Lewis Cass, and give Taylor the win. So at this point, the American political system is really all messed up, probably the most complicated really in a nation's history as far as the variety of parties that are at work here. Okay, so all that mix up really just gives Zachary Taylor the win. And it's easy for a lot of Americans to get behind him because he was a kind of a popular, successful general during the Mexican-American War. And that's going to be enough to go, I don't know what all this stuff is. I'm going to vote for the general. That's the direction most states are going to take. And so this is going to really accelerate these debates even further now that you have all these political parties that are splitting up. California is going to join the Union during this time in the late 1840s, early 1850s, but as a free state. California largely wants to be a free state. And so now that means that slave states could now be a minority in Congress. And you're going to start to get a little bit more and more talk of some of these slave states threatening secession. Okay. But once again, Henry Clay, and this is kind of the end of Henry Clay's great compromising. He's done a lot of compromises in the past. He's going to propose this 8-resolution kind of bill that's going to exhaustively try to appeal to both sides. Now, John C. Calhoun's going to oppose this, but it's going to be supported by the North's Daniel Webster, who's kind of very important and a prominent Northern politician of this time. And this is going to be the Compromise of 1850. And what this compromise does is basically it's not going to do a whole lot to change things, really. It's just going to be a little more, tick-tacky kind of things to, avoid either side getting mad. So it's really just kind of forestalling the inevitable. This is yet another compromise that doesn't do a whole lot, but it does do one thing. It does enact a fugitive slave law, which the southern states are happy about. Okay, so there is, again, Compromise of 1850, not a lot to talk about, but it does ban slavery in Washington, D.C., and also enacts a fugitive slave law that's going to be important. And I won't spend too much time on this, but there's a lot of changes of the guard during this time because Taylor actually opposed this compromise, but he's going to die in office due to the stomach disease that he had. And now the vice president, Millard Fillmore, is going to step into the job. Calhoun himself is also going to die. And so Webster is going to move on to also move out of Congress into the Secretary of State role. And Stephen Douglas, who's going to be an important guy I mentioned more later, a young senator from Illinois, is now going to take charge and really be the chief architect behind that compromise of 1850. So again, it doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot. It's more just like forestalling the inevitable, making both sides feel like they get a win, we ban slavery in Washington, D.C. Oh, I guess that's good. But at the same time, enacts a fugitive slave law. So both North and South feel like they get something out of that. But again, doesn't do a whole heck of a lot. So what is this Fugitive Slave Act or slave law that's enacted? Basically allows protections for these slave catchers to venture north and to capture, kidnap, basically find any of these runaway slaves. Now, believe it or not, this sounds like it would be a good thing for the South, but it actually does more harm for them than good, because a lot of Northerners are starting to get really annoyed and agitated about all these Southerners who are going north and kidnapping these people that they just kind of see as people who aren't really doing anything wrong. They might not see them as equal people. Again, some of these white people don't even see their African-American neighbors or, coworkers as necessarily this on par with whites, but they do still feel that there's a level of cruelty to this that they cannot really get behind. Newspaper accounts of these captures are going to start horrifying Southerners. And Henry David Thoreau, who again was one of those prominent kind of transcendentalist thinkers that I mentioned some time ago, he's going to go as far as to advocate for an important thing, position that'll be important later on in the civil rights movement, known as civil disobedience, where he's basically saying, hey, you know what? If we don't buy into this law, it's our right to actually actively ignore the law entirely. So what this really meant was oftentimes some of these slave catchers would go north and they would try to capture a runaway African-American slave. They would take off and they would kind of point at a random person and say, hey, you're deputized. It's now your responsibility to come and you help me capture this person. And a lot of these white people are like, I'm on my way to work. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. It's not my responsibility to help you capture this slave. So he's saying, listen, we need to practice civil disobedience. If we don't agree with the laws on a moral or ethical level, they just don't apply to us. Okay, so that's going to be very important when it comes to fostering more and more animosity by Northerners towards slavery and these Southerners who want to capture these runaway slaves. And at the same time, you're starting to get the birth and the evolution of the Underground Railroad. Now, there was no official kind of pathway of what the Underground Railroad was, but it was this informal but well-kept kind of system that does go a long way to kind of getting a lot of slaves out of harm's way between the 1840s and 1850s, and it even goes as far as to help thousands escape. Okay, so there's kind of a series of outposts that they would secretly try to go to that had some food, some shelter, and even in some cases some money to provide for the people who are trying to escape. And most famously, Harriet Tubman's going to be she's going to be known as the chief conductor of sorts of the Underground Railroad. Tubman herself was a runaway slave, and there was a huge reward offered for her capture, but she was tough, and she was one of the truest patriots we've ever had in our nation, and she's just going to keep going and keep fighting and make sure that, that other slaves escape the system as well. So, again, this Fugitive Slave Act sounds like it's great on paper for white Southerners who were trying to capture these escaped slaves. But between all this Northern animosity of white Northerners getting more and more turned off by the fact that this has to ruin their day or ruin their, kind of their daily routine, combined with the expansion of the Underground Railroad, as it turns out, this Fugitive Slave Act is doing more harm than good for the South. And at the same time all this is happening, a very famous, influential book is going to be written known as Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who herself is from Ohio, in response to the fugitive slave law. Now, this book is going to sell as many as 300,000 copies in the first few years, which is an astounding number for that era. So 300,000 copies nationwide, that's a big deal, okay? And not only that, it is very important for us to mention in another sense that Harriet Beecher Stowe is a woman author who's getting this level of attention. And you didn't have a lot of women authors get all that level of attention. So that's an important kind of key welcome evolution in that regard, right? Now, this book is not the best written book of all time. There's a lot better books that you point out to this era. But what is important about it is it has a huge impact on Northern readers. Readers who were maybe apathetic towards or maybe even softly in favor of slavery read this book. And the fact that, and this sounds crazy for us today, the fact that it presents African Americans as just fully functioning real human beings who are imprisoned by dreadful circumstances really distresses and starts to send off some alarm bells for more and more of these Northerners to say, hey, wait a minute, you know what? Maybe African Americans are real human beings. Again, it's laughable to us now that that was even something that had to be brought up, okay, and just really speaks to how backwards, frankly, this time was. But it is going to start to get some people like saying, hey, you know what? Uncle Tom and some of these other characters, they're actually, human beings that have souls who are important. Okay. Now, a lot of people read the book. Obviously, it was 300,000 copies, but more and more people are going to see dramatic interpretations of it, meaning they're going to see plays depicting it. Now, again, there's no Netflix back then. There's no broadcast television. So there's no way for uniformly everybody to see this. But the fact that it's being performed all across the country, mostly in the North, you can't expect a lot of this to be happening in the South. That does broaden its appeal, especially towards a working class who generally didn't care about abolitionism, right? They didn't think it was that important of a thing, and they're maybe not inclined to read the book. A lot of them went to go see the play, and their minds are going to start to be changed by this as well, okay? Southerners naturally are going to be outraged by this. They're going to try to ban the book from the South, and it's still going to go on to sell millions of copies. And this single book is really one of the most important, influential books in all of American history, not because it was that great of a book or a piece of literature, but because we, as historians, can identify this as one of the direct causes for the Civil War. It's this level of hostility and animosity that's been growing in the North towards the South with regards to slavery, and the fact that this book was able to treat slavery as it was, as a barbaric institution that is keeping, our fellow human beings down. That is, again, going to be a direct cause for the Civil War. And again, the South, naturally, they don't like it, but the Northerners who are, again, maybe on the fence about abolition or didn't really care, are all of a sudden going to come to that side and say, hey, wait a minute, you know what? Maybe this is something that needs to be seriously addressed. So all these problems are going to lead to some other kind of acts or purchases and whatnot. The Gadsden Purchase in 1853, this is kind of just one quick thing to go over. Mexico is going to sell the U.S. about a 30,000 mile tract of land between, kind of the southern tip of New Mexico as well as Arizona, that basically cuts through there, and all in the name of the Transcontinental Railroad. So the Transcontinental Railroad is a possibility of something that can be built that's going to connect east and west through the railroads. And so that's going to be purchased from Mexico to encourage, that kind of railroad that's being built from east to west. And this is also going to promote a lot more people to move further west and to settle along these communities. Now, that Stephen Douglas, that very influential guy in Illinois state politics, he's going to propose opening up a lot of this kind of northern Great Plains territory to settlements, which now all of a sudden puts territories like Kansas and Nebraska in the Senate, and that's going to lead to more and more hostilities and more problems. But that does lead to the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854, which is technically allows for popular sovereignty in Nebraska and Kansas. So it's saying, hey, Kansas, Nebraska, you both can have popular sovereignty. But under the table and behind closed doors, and even kind of semi-publicly, it's basically heavily implied that, hey, we got to keep this, we got to keep these North and South even. So, hey, Nebraska, we really highly encourage you to be the free state. And Kansas, we really kind of highly encourage you to be the slave state. Okay, so Kansas and Nebraska technically are allowed to pick for themselves. But again, they're trying to push Nebraska into being the free state, Kansas the slave state, to try to keep that balance as it is and to avoid any sort of further hostilities. But that really only opens the door specifically to Kansas, with more levels of violence that are going to be perpetrated, because Kansas is going to be the real first battleground when it comes to popular sovereignty versus kind of free soil, because both sides are desperately trying to get more and more people on their side. You got the people against slavery, the people for slavery, to trying to flip the territory when they're voting, whether they're going to be pro or anti. So a lot of Northerners are going to flock there carrying guns and supplies, and a lot of them are going to be ready for direct conflict, okay? And the pro-slave Senator David Atchison is going to encourage his own people to move over from Missouri. He's going to encourage his own people to move from Missouri into Kansas to make sure that, hey, no, we need to go the other way. He's pro-slavery, and he's going to deem these people border ruffians who are trying to come in and flip it the other way, okay? So both sides even in Kansas, established their own government. So you have a pro-slave government in Kansas and an anti-slave government in Kansas, and they're both writing their own constitutions. They're putting them in direct opposition to one another. And this violence that's kind of was on the rise is going to officially spill out onto the streets on May 21st, 1856, where these border ruffians are going to attack Lawrence, Kansas, which is an anti-slavery stronghold, and they're going to destroy newspaper presses, plunder shops, burn down even a hotel and the home of the Free State governor. And the national newspapers are looking at this situation in Kansas and call it Bleeding Kansas, where 200 are going to be left dead, and there's going to be, $2 million worth of property damage. Now, I'm not saying, property damage is equal to human lives, because human lives are infinitely more important, but the level of destruction is going to get a lot of people all across the country paying close attention to this situation. So again, Kansas was technically supposed to vote for it, slave or anti-slave. But again, that Kansas-Nebraska Act was saying, hey, why don't you go more in the slave direction? But there's going to be enough anti-slavery people there saying, no, we don't want to do that. And they're armed. The pro-slavery people are armed. And this leads to direct conflict that leads to the unfortunate loss of over 200 lives. So this situation in Kansas is really kind of serving as an opening salvo for what is going to really happen when it comes to this civil unrest, okay? And quite famously and infamously, this level of civil unrest is actually going to translate itself into the actual Senate floor. Okay, so in mid-May of 1856, Charles Sumner, he was a prominent senator from Massachusetts, which you could imagine, northern state. He's a fierce abolitionist. He gives a speech where he accuses the pro-slavery senators of forcing Kansas into being a slave state. He calls it out as it is. He's saying, listen, you're trying to force Kansas to pick and choose what it wants to be, and they should have the choice. We should let Kansas decide, not these pro-slavery senators decide. And he's even going to go after one guy in particular, Senator Andrew P. Butler from South Carolina. When he calls Butler, he says Butler has chosen a mistress, a harlot, slavery. So he's basically saying you're committing adultery with the United States by getting in bed with slavery, quite literally. And so this is seen as a very salacious charge and really, kind of a dirty thing to say, even though in some ways it was obviously true. Butler's second cousin, Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina, is going to hear what Sumner says, and he's, again, Butler's second cousin, so he takes this personally. He quite literally goes up to Sumner on the floor of the Senate, takes a club, berates, first of all, not his club, his cane actually, is going to berate Sumner, and then he's going to beat Sumner savagely on the floor of the U.S. Senate and leave Sumner severely injured, okay? So many consider in the South Brooks a hero. Brooks is standing up to these Northerners who want to disparage the South, who want to disparage, proud Southerners who are trying to do what they're going to do. And meanwhile, in the North, they're angry about this, right? And so this incident in 1856 is really sending off a lot of alarm bells in the North and South, that this is how bad this situation of slavery is getting, where we actually, it's one thing for something to happen in Kansas far enough away, and that actually led to loss of life, so I'm not trying to discount that. But it's one thing for it to happen in Kansas and the far reaches of the West, but then when you have two, a senator and representative, members of our U.S. Congress fighting one another in the Senate, on the Senate floor, that is a recipe for disaster and really signals to both North and South, hey, this is getting out of hand. Is it possible for us to even reconcile the situation? There's only so many compromises we can make before something much more disastrous is going to happen. Okay. So that does it for us today. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I'll be sure to answer those for you. Take care.